Welcome to the literature review session. We will spend a few minutes looking at your research proposal. As you can see from this diagram, it has three general areas. The actual proposals may differ in the sections they tackle, but by and large, they all contain these three sections: identification of your research area, your research aim, research question, which could be synthesized as my research project is about. Then an outline of relevant literature informing your research, which will need to distinguish between theoretical and empirical contributions to literature. And finally, your research method and methodology. Again, and as we mentioned previously, these two will need to be separated. Let's talk about the first one, the research problem, your research question. You will also encounter this as the research aim. They are not exactly the same, the problem, question, and research aim, but they are interrelated. The first thing you will need to address in that section is what is the research problem the study will address, and do so quite explicitly. Sometimes the students express this point in implicit terms, but they don't actually say it explicitly in one or two sentences, and this is quite important to be specified. Then, what is the general background of this research problem? How did you come about it? How did you come to think this may be important to address? What are the research questions through which the problem will be addressed in your study? In other words, breakdown of your research problem or your research aim into sub-problems, if you wish, expressed as questions. And finally, what makes this research problem interesting, relevant, and important? A way to arrive at your research problem is using the inverted pyramid analogy. In your literature review, you would start with broad issues, then narrow down to studies which overlap with your research, and further down to studies that are directly related to your investigation. The broad issues, for example, in a study about reward values and their impact on performance at work, you could start with broad issues to do with human agency in organizations. So quite broad, little bit related, but still very, very wide. Then you could narrow it down to studies overlapping with your research. In other words, wider studies about motivation. And then further down to studies that are directly related to your investigation. So, for example, studies on reward value, studies on performance, the other element of your research problem. Exactly what we mean by performance. Don't forget, it is a concept, and as a concept, it is abstract. It requires explanation. So there you were. For example, in a study of reward values linking with performance, you will start with human agency, narrowing down to, say, motivation, narrowing down to particularly those two aspects, reward values on the one hand and performance on the other hand. Finally, and perhaps most important, and again often sadly forgotten by students, is that you need to provide a justification of the research question chosen in relation to the gaps to knowledge identified. Now, if you look at this slide, it pretty much gives you the overall structure of your literature review, which will need to start with background of the area of interest, moving on to studies directly related to your question, and providing a separate section on how your study will contribute to covering a gap in knowledge. Now, moving to the second area of your research proposal, the actual literature review. What is important to cover in that literature review is work that has already been done in the area. Don't forget, the area does not come out of thin air. Your research topic already exists, so work has been done on it already. What theoretical arguments have been expressed in that area? What empirical evidence is available. If you remember, it's important to distinguish between theoretical contributions and empirical contributions to the literature. What methods and methodologies have been utilized. This is very important because through identifying those, you may discover that your particular research area is dominated by a particular methodology, and there may be a good reason for it. Therefore, if you wish to employ a different methodology, you should justify the need for that. You should give some thought to why most scholars chose A and you are inclined to choose B. And then again, really important, as mentioned previously, identified gaps. You need to identify theoretical, empirical, and methodological gaps in the existing literature. Another area which your research proposal will cover is the description of your methodology and method. In other words, with what method will your proposed project be conducted? How, where, and when will you conduct your data collection? How will you analyze that data? What is the general timetable for conducting the research? This is useful to assess the feasibility of your choices. And finally, what do you expect the strengths and weaknesses of your selected method to be? So in a nutshell, you will have 3 main sections to your research proposal. One has to do with identification of your research area and research questions. Section 2 will have to do with identification of literature. And section 3, research method and methodology, which some of you simply call methodology, because methodology could be argued to include research methods.